You know, we have been talking quite a bit about game design and how designers have to balance how much they control a narrative versus letting the player craft the narrative, but this perspective will only get us so far in figuring out why morality and moral concepts seem to suffer in games. So it's time to shift our focus. In this video, we will examine morality in a more general context and why the nature of morality presents challenges for game designers. And by examining morality in this manner, I think we will get a little closer to what makes morality so tricky to model in the video game world. Or at the very least, we'll prattle on a bit about moral philosophy, which is always fun. Morality at its heart is about the use of thoughts, words, and actions. When these actions are ordered toward the nature of the human person, that is what we call good. Conversely, that which does not conform to the proper nature of the human person is evil. Simple, right? Well, I'm going to have to stop you right there, eager young developer. Let's talk a little bit about the complexity of actions. Consider the use of a knife, for example. One can use a knife to peel fruit, say for my son who has an insatiable appetite, or one can use a knife to stab someone and take his wallet. And obviously a lot of things one can do in between. Are you seeing the issue yet? Think about all those possible uses of a single knife that have the potential for moral implications. Can you imagine just trying to code and test every possible use of a knife? You could spend years doing just that. Now, most likely if a knife is introduced as an item in a game, a specific set of actions already exist in the developer's mind. So this consideration of multiple uses for a knife isn't part of the equation. But if you stop and think about it, you can see the emergence of an interesting problem in modeling morality. Games are ultimately a model of reality and fantasy. A design team's implementation of an approximation of actions we can take in everyday life combined with their attempt to represent fantastical elements in a digital context. And in this approximation, we lose a lot of potential options for actions. This is a bit of a no-brainer, but if you think about it, this is one of the reasons why morality feels limiting in games. If actions in general are limited by the approximation aspect of games, potential for moral nuance in games has already been reduced, since the potential actions a gamer can take has been reduced compared to real life. Words, or dialogue options in games, are even more restrictive. Language and how we communicate are very complex aspects of human nature. I mean, from a logical standpoint, that various sounds and gestures can transmit ideas in and of itself is fascinating. We don't understand it as much as we'd like to say we do. So imagine a developer trying to model communication in games. His options are quite limited. Each gesture or dialogue option must be represented as a particular choice. Only very specific things can be said. The player has very little control beyond the options given by the developer, which is quite constricting. Furthermore, typically, conversation options devolve into purely informational choices or stark good-bad choices. The dialogue itself may be nuanced or otherwise well-written, but choices either generate information and or are classified as good or bad ones with little nuance. Some games offer morally ambiguous choices but seem to have little impact on the morality of the player. As far as thought, how does one even? For those who think that reason is simply chemicals interacting in the brain, I'll put a link in the description of one of the many problems with this idea. The human's ability to reason has quite a few unknowns to it. So much so that as far as I know, developers haven't tried to model a player character's thoughts and simply let the player substitute their own thoughts for the character. This is usually reflected in the dialogue selection screens or actions where the player thinks and chooses which option to use. In fact, as I'm writing this review, I'm wondering if it's possible to make a game where the player shapes the thoughts of the character to the point where that shaping influences the character. I'd love to see that. In any event, thought is the beginning of morality when it comes to humans. Our thoughts can change the morality of an action when it comes to being a good person. We can do the right thing for selfish reasons, for example. This requirement of the player's thought without being able to contextualize that thought in a game creates a disconnect in the moral framing of moral actions in games. In other media, the characters are all defined down to their thoughts, creating the morality of such characters. In games, a player must fill in the thinking of a character. So why are these missing aspects of thought, word, and action so important? One of the biggest issues with incorporating moral nuance into games is that player options are radically reduced. Part of the struggle in life is figuring out how to apply moral principles to specific situations. And being able to adhere to those principles even when some of them may be in tension with each other is a huge part of moral struggle in life. In gaming, this tension often comes to a point. Games more often than not present choices in stark terms. This is because every action that the player can take requires a lot of work to implement in the model. As a result, games often attempt only one good and one evil choice, so moral nuance is reduced to binary choices. The choices in question attempt to leave no doubt as to what is the good versus bad choice. As the possibilities get reduced, so do the opportunities to resolve moral issues. Thus, the nuance in moral issues in games must also be reduced to match the potential actions the character can take. This leaves the player with a narrow moral presentation and few choices for resolution. This to me is one of the reasons why players seem dissatisfied with morality in games. Intuitively, we know that our options are more limited in games than they are in life. Our desire to figure out our way through moral situations is sharply curtailed by the limitations of the model. Complex situations in games wind up being reduced to a few choices that, at times, can actually reduce the complexity of the narrative introduced in the game, like a certain Mage-Templar dynamic in a major game. Not naming names, but you know who you are. So how is this solved? Well, that is a video in and of itself. But suffice to say a few ways that could help are paying more attention to choice design vis-a-vis the narrative. Don't build a complex and fulfilling world only to reduce it to meager choices. Your choices must be as complex as the narrative you are building. Define characters more concretely. Nothing is more frustrating to the story-driven player than to be presented with choices that do not reflect what the player considers the character building toward. Again, the choices must reflect not only the situation, but the characters themselves. Greater study of moral philosophy. The more complicated the moral dilemma, the more likely players will diverge in their interpretation of the morality of the choices. Those ideas must be taken into consideration, or at the very least, individual choices must be designed in a way to be as flexible as possible. And that's a wrap. Morality is one of the central aspects of human experience, so it's no wonder that developers have struggled with incorporating that into games. But until more thought is given to the limiting aspects of game models with regard to moral philosophy, games and developers will continue to struggle to incorporate morality in a more meaningful fashion. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next time. Hey everyone, thanks for watching my video to the end. If you like more of this, you can click on the subscribe link at the bottom, and as you can see, there are a couple of other videos that you can click on as well. One of them is one of my prior reviews or another content video, and the other one is going to be a playthrough that I'm doing. So feel free to click on either one. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and thanks very much.